Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, her memoir of family, identity, and walking herself home, Brittany Penner's Children Like Us, is out through Doubleday Canada now. She joins me on the program. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So this, as I understand it, I mean, is it an outgrowth of the piece that you wrote for the Globe?
Not really. The piece I wrote for the Globe was my first foray into the public world in writing about my story, but I wouldn't say would be an outgrowth necessarily as happening around the same time.
Okay. I was curious if, maybe the reaction to that piece people were asking to kind of explore this further, or you had already kind of decided yourself to explore this further, it sounds like.
Yeah, if I recall, I think I was wanting to write more, wanting to share more, and started both around the same time, or exploring both around the same time.
At one point you talk about, you did some, self-record keeping, you wrote some journals that did you go back to those at some point and start reading them and then see a path towards this book? Or, what prompted this book and exploring your life in this depth?
Mm-hmm. I was feeling this sort of nagging desire to only grow and grow and grow a couple of years ago to just write, period. And then around that time, I had also stopped doing, as part of my medical practice, I had stopped doing overnight call shifts with doing low risk obstetrics. And so that kind of opened up some mental space for me at the time. And I was just writing more. And this actually started as a novel idea, wanting to kind of track the lives of 3 generations of women, one an indigenous line, and one a settler line, if you want to call it that, and how they intersect through an adoption that happens generations later, until I realized, well, this is my story. I'm just trying to fictionalize it, which I think can be a really useful tool to start writing sometimes. But for me, it just became very evident, like, why not just say the thing? Because sometimes novels and fictionalized stories can be really impactful and powerful if that's what the story is calling for. And sometimes if this is just the real story, then tell the real story.
Were you obscuring things about your own story in that fiction purposefully, like kind of like to shield yourself initially, and then you built up the courage to tell your own story? Or like what were the machinations of deciding initially as a fictional thing?
I think the idea of 3 generations and exploring that fictionally, just the idea of it gave me more liberty to kind of that I wouldn't be bound by having to that I could explore the depths of each generation's lives a lot more and a lot broader. Whereas when it's nonfiction, you're limited by people's memories, essentially, in terms of how deep you can go, and then your own speculation and your own kind of investigative type of work. And so it wasn't so much the idea of shielding as much as felt like a bigger space to work with, until I just realized that the space that I have to work with my own story is pretty big already.
So it was more so the limitations of what you knew about the real story. Maybe you couldn't do that through like multiple generations thing without making some stuff up.
Yeah, especially with my biological family, because I didn't know my great grandmother and I didn't know my grandmother really, and both had passed away since then. And so the idea of exploring it fictionally just felt like I could tell their stories in greater depth and not be limited by the information I did not have.
So then when you decide I'm going to do this. I'm going to tell my own story, but I have these limitations. How did you kind of go about writing your way out of that?
I think it was pretty easy because I didn't go very far um, in the novel idea because it became pretty evident within like the first couple of weeks of me exploring this that I wanted to um, tell the story, tell my story, or at least my understanding of it. And so I don't think it was very difficult at all because I hadn't gone down the novel path very much at all, really.
Right. So the book is somewhat framed by photographs and like video images that you're recalling. Like, did you start kind of like pulling together what you had as far as a record of your childhood and using those as like jumping off points to remind yourself about what happened, or was that something that got brought in later on after you started writing?
It got brought in later on. Um, Initially, I had written the entire manuscript without any of it. Um, and then I basically rewrote the entire thing because it just wasn't the book, the first manuscript. Um, and it just seemed like, so I had always been kind of, and I explore this in the book, I had chronically been reflecting back and looking back and trying to search for clues as to the story of my childhood through looking at photographs and VHS tapes and sort of any evidence in the past, because sometimes my memories are not always reliable, um, which is part of just the nature of memory, I suppose. Um, and I think when there's a certain element of loss and recurrent loss, sometimes you start questioning your own experience, and whether things happened in the way that you remember them or if your emotions obscured anything. So I was always, just throughout my entire life, always looking back and trying to remember the family that I had known and lost, and trying to, I suppose, seek the family that I had never quite known but still lost. And so the book, I think I got to a point where I wanted the book to be somewhat a reflection of that process for me. And the way that that came forth was incorporating those video and photograph kind of mementos or moments because they really mirrored real life for me.
I want to pull at maybe two things you said there. The first of it, you said, the manuscript wasn't the book, the first draft.
Mhm.
Wondering what you mean by that.
It was a recounting of my life, but it just wasn't infused, I think, with the level of emotional honesty that I wanted, and I didn't at the time know how to get there. And it felt more like a recounting and not a, the best way I can describe it is kind of like a transcript of my life compared to a woven blanket or quilt of my life, if that makes sense.
So one would be like a day by day kind of this is what happened to me versus kind of a reflection on what that meant.
More like a this is the story how I remember it, and these were my emotions and my experience at the time. Um, but not necessarily integrated with what I know now, and not necessarily integrated with what I've learned since then. Whereas the book as it stands now, at least the way that I've tried to make it is more like a woven, like I'm weaving in the experience and the experiences and the life lived along with perspective I've gained along the way, along with the emotional honesty of the time that maybe in the first draft I wasn't sure how to really hold.
How did you figure out writing it that way then, after that first draft? Was it like, did you kind of pull back and realize that was something that was missing and you needed to get there? Or did a second pass at it allow you, the knowledge of the shape of things, but allow you to kind of explore it in a different way?
I think the biggest thing was time. I took several months away from it. I think that was a big piece of it. And another big piece was when I sat down to rewrite it again, it was at least 6 months later, I think. And I had taken time fully away from my clinical practice. And so I was just fully immersed in the book and not having to, I had someone covering for me at the time and not having to worry about anything outside of the book for that chunk of time. That was a big part of it for me. And probably just further reflection upon some of the things that I wanted to talk about and integrating it and being in a bit of a more present space when I sat down to write it again.
The other thing that you, from the prior question that I wanted to kind of pull back to was you were talking about, remembering things and whether it was inflected by, feeling. This is an emotional book, and I'm curious about kind of allowing yourself that space to be emotional while reflecting on the past, and how difficult was that, like a tightrope walk for you as a writer?
It wasn't, not really. And I think because I had done so much, I mean, therapy, if I'm honest, and sitting with things and reflecting and integrating experiences and really kind of sitting with younger versions of myself, kind of emotionally and psychologically speaking. And so when it came to writing the book, there were some difficult sections where I didn't necessarily know how to approach it on the page. And the way that I would approach it, at least before getting to the page, would just be kind of having a conversation with my imagined self or the part that I still carry within myself from that time period. Let's say if I'm 13, kind of sitting with the 13-year-old version of myself and saying, having a bit of a conversation and saying, we don't have to write about anything that you don't want on the page, reminding myself or reminding that part of myself that I'm safe, that even though writing about it and talking about it can make you feel like you're kind of back in the emotions of it, in reality, you're not. In reality, you are a 30-something-year-old woman who's revisiting it. And so there was just a lot of kind of holding myself in those spaces, if that makes sense.
I believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, like towards the end, you talk about like where you're actually walking yourself home, right? And it's not necessarily at home. You're in a field or a path, kind of partway between your birth grandmother's place and your own home. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
That you kind of pulled off the road and stopped at after her funeral, but that you've returned to that place and actually walk yourself home. That you have that time to reflect, and it sounds like during those periods you are actually like thinking about your younger self and talking in conversation with your younger self, and this maybe is kind of on the page capturing some of what was going on in your head on those walks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
How did you did the place just speak to you and pull you off the road, and then it allowed you a space kind of that you weren't tied to necessarily, that you could do this work?
Yeah, I don't know how to explain it anything further than um I pulled off the road and found a path that just felt right to walk on. And it was as simple and as unexpected as that.
So, I mean, that obviously is the subtitle of this book, the latter part of the subtitle. Is that, did you ever conceive of that as being the title of the book? Like Walking Myself Home? Or like, why did you land on instead Children Like Us?
Hmm. That actually wasn't even the original title. When I was meeting with I think Doubleday, when we were going through the process of selling the book, I had met with him, and the one phrase that kept coming up was, you know, and I think in maybe some of the early drafts, it was, kids like us, children like us, XYZ, children like us, this and that. And actually, when my cousin George, who's in the book, had read one of the versions, when he was talking to me, he had used the phrase children like us. Um, and he was like, I didn't even catch myself that that was the title of the book until I just said it now. And so I think the reason why I settled on it was because that was a really common, sort of unspoken mantra, and not even a mantra, but maybe an unspoken belief growing up where, well, these sorts of things just happen to kids like us being Indigenous kids placed in the system at some point. And it felt like by far the truest, if you can encapsulate something within a couple of words for a title of a book, Children Like Us felt like the truest representation of that.
In that it didn't just speak to your own experience, but that you were part of a larger experience.
Mm-hmm.
How cognizant of that, like, did you feel some responsibility about writing a memoir that reflected on like your own experience, but that was part of a larger, like as your cousin George points out, like you were part of the Sixties Scoop, right? That like in the same way that we, kind of thought residential schools ended long before they actually ended, the Sixties Scoop lasted longer than we consider when we call it the 60s.
Yeah. I think I was cognizant of it at the level of I was telling my story, and in some ways I was also um, telling George's story and telling some of my cousin's stories, and not necessarily the exact same story, but our sort of collective experience. And I don't know if it tells, if it highlights the stories of many others. I haven't necessarily received much feedback in that regard, and so I don't know if I can say um, whether that's true or not, but I was definitely cognizant of the patterns that were present in my life as a result of being placed in the system when I was born, and then the themes and patterns that were present in my cousins' lives did represent very common themes and patterns on a much larger sort of national scale.
How, like, because there's some hard things to write about, I would imagine, in this book, whether it's with your adopted parents or, your relationship with your birth mother when you kind of connect later in life, some of the things that happen in your own life. Was there anything that in writing it was too difficult and that you decided to leave out, or did you kind of have to face everything and put it on the page? Like I'm always curious about, because you are, as an author, you're going to end up having to do readings or talk, in an interview like this about stuff. If you withhold stuff because of the like thought that like I don't want to face this with other people, even if I can face it with myself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, and something that would be by far the thing I wrestled with the most when I was writing this. There were, without question, some very specific things I intentionally left out. And I think you talked to 10 different writers and 10 different, like, memoir writers, and they're going to have 10 different responses in terms of what they include and what they don't include. And so my approach to that was I wanted to tell as honest of a story as I could, that conveyed the life that I've lived, while also being very aware that there are other very real people that are portrayed in this book. And I weighed each thing that I did not include with the question of if including this cause more potential difficulty or pain in their lives, then it would contribute to the overall story and honesty of the story. And what does that look like? And so there was a lot of intentionality behind what I did not include. And sometimes that's hard because you really do wonder, well, some things have happened and I'm not including that here. And it's hard because you don't want it to sacrifice your truth or your experience. But at the same time, I don't know if I landed on the right decision. I'm hoping that I did, but I suppose only time and seeing how things unfold with the book will tell me that.
You include like a bibliography of suggested reading. Like, had you read other memoirs in the time that you were writing your memoir, and did that help you in terms of making a decision like that about like what to withhold or how to kind of navigate those kind of truths?
It helped me. So I read a few different memoirs. I was careful about um, some of the memoirs I read, and I found that sometimes I would lean towards reading, let's say, fiction in terms of like if I was struggling with how to portray certain personality traits on the page or pacing or things like that, I would find myself attracted to certain types of books, whether they were fiction or nonfiction. Um, there were some things that I'm trying to think back now, um, where I did read maybe some nonfiction books that inspired me. Like a good one that came to mind was reading some of Tanya Talega's work, um, which it's largely like nonfiction and very journalistic in nature, but it felt very inspiring to tell parts of my story. Um, but I wouldn't say I followed anyone's lead when it came to, oh, they included this, so I think then I feel okay including this. It was much more of a personal scene by scene or moment by moment kind of decision.
Right. The book begins with uh, a request of the reader under the title "A Word on Hope,"
Mhm.
and about making space for the possibility of hope, even if you're not hopeful. How important was that, and was it a difficult thing to write, to ask of a reader to kind of like start the book this way?
It wasn't a difficult thing to write at all. It was actually fairly easy for me to ask. And I think that I was asking myself that I was making that request of myself as much as I was for the reader. Because hope is something that has always been very scary for me to engage with. It's a very kind of scary concept, because it does feel very, for me, it's by far one of the most vulnerable um, spaces for me to engage with. And so I was writing it, yeah, to myself as much as to the reader. And
Do you
and
see?
it's still something that I remind myself of, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Do you see hope as the inverse of fear? Like, because you do write about, being fearful of being, taken away like your siblings were, right? That
Mm.
was hope difficult because of the fearful nature of your childhood, or are they kind of tied inextricably together?
That's a really good question. I think fear felt a lot safer because it kept me vigilant. And I don't know if you can engage with hope if you are always vigilant and fearful. And yet, I don't know if hope can be felt without an element of fear. And so it feels like a both and for me.
Right.
But I would say I didn't feel very hopeful many times throughout my childhood, because it felt like feeling hopeful left you much too vulnerable and much too open for when things would inevitably happen.
That if you live hopeful, that it's like the rose-colored glasses, and as soon as you take those off, you see the darkness.
More like if you live hopeful, you're living naive, yeah. And also then you're unprotected. Because if you are fearful and if you are thinking things through as much as like, if I do this, then this could get me taken away. And if I do this, or if I say this could take me away, then you have some measures in place, at least in your mind, to protect you. Whereas hope does nothing except allow you to be blindsided.
Was writing this then an act of hope?
I think in part, yeah.
Now that I mean, because obviously the life cycle of a book is that this is you've been done with writing this for a while. The book is now out. Having had a bit of separation from the creative process and the making of this book, what are your thoughts about it now?
I think my thoughts about it now are tricky for me to nail down because I have to continuously remind myself that my work with the book is done and it has its own legs now, and it's the job of the book to kind of live its own life, and how others respond to it and how others react to it, I have zero control over, which is a very scary thing, but it's a very real thing. Um, I still, I think, don't know fully if I landed on the right decision in each thing that I didn't include or that I did include. And I am sure that if I were to revisit this in 5 years or 10 years, it would be another different book, as I think it should be, because that just reflects the evolution of our lives. And so right now I am trying to be present in the early life of the public nature of this book.
But you can no longer be vigilant in terms of its creation. You just have to kind of be guarded about how people react to it in some sense.
Yeah, and I think that's a tricky thing because living guarded and living um, with that in mind is not necessarily a fun or enjoyable place to be, at least not for me. And so it's a matter of, I think, at least reminding myself that um, my hope for the book, like, remind myself of what my hopes for the book are, and that as much as I would have certain hopes, I can't ultimately control it, and I have to be okay with that and accept it and move forward regardless of the response to it.
So can you share what your hope for the book is?
Yeah, I think, I mean, and this feels very bold to hope for, but my hope is that it can allow some Indigenous people across the country to feel less alone in their experiences, especially people who have had either experiences being adopted or in the foster care system, that this can not necessarily speak to their stories because all of our stories are different, but even just invite them to feel less alone, really. That's been, I think, my biggest hope for the book. And then other hopes would be, I think, just even for non-Indigenous people who we all have different life experiences, that something like with the thought of someone reading my book and feeling, oh, I have maybe a bit of more compassion for my younger self, or I never actually dealt with this traumatic thing in my life, or I never felt like I could, and now I feel a bit more space to engage with that or to um, find some healing. That feels like a really amazing thought to me. And I'm not bold enough to say that that will do that for people, but I certainly would love that if it could. And then also, I think shedding light and understanding on, I think there are many narratives around adoption, especially in adoption of Indigenous kids. And the narratives, at least I certainly grew up with, would have been lucky you were adopted by a non-Indigenous family. Therefore, you have this really beautiful life that I know nothing about, but I know you're Indigenous and you were raised by white parents. Therefore, you must have a good life. And my hope is that the book highlights the nuance that nothing is ever as simple as that.
Well, those are really great hopes for the book. Thank you for sharing not only those hopes, but your time with me today. Children Like Us, out through Doubleday Canada. Brittany Penner, thanks very much for joining me on the program.
Thanks so much, Michael.